My brother pointed at me next to my mother's casket and told 40 people I ruined this family. I didn't say a word back. I just stood there in a black suit that still smelled like the dry cleaner's plastic, and I let him say it. Because I already knew something he didn't. My mother had left me a letter, sealed, dated, waiting in a funeral director's office drawer for exactly this moment. And it was about to end everything he thought he understood about the last 6 years of our lives. My name is Walter Doss. I'm 66 years old. I run a small furniture restoration shop on Peoria Avenue in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the kind of place that smells like linseed oil and sawdust and takes 3 weeks to refinish a rocking chair because I don't rush things. I always believed that if you just kept showing up, kept doing the right thing quietly, it would eventually be seen. I was wrong about the timing. For 6 years, nobody saw what I was doing except my wife, my mother, and a hospice nurse named Renee, who still calls me every February on my mother's birthday. Everyone else saw exactly what my brother wanted them to see. I'll never forget standing at that graveside, the Oklahoma wind pulling at the funeral tent, my brother Roland's voice cracking in a way that sounded like grief, but wasn't. I'll get to that moment. I need you to understand what came before it first, because the letter in that drawer didn't just answer one accusation. It answered 6 years of them. Let me back up. My mother's name was Eleanor Doss. She was 89 years old when she passed, in April, in a house on Zunis Avenue in the Brookside neighborhood that she and my father bought in 1968 for $19,500, back when Brookside was still mostly open lots and cottonwood trees. My father died in 2011, heart attack in the garage, wrench still in his hand, working on a lawnmower that didn't need fixing nearly as bad as he thought it did. My mother lived alone in that house for 8 years afterward, stubborn as a fence post, refusing every suggestion that she move somewhere smaller, somewhere with a call button on a lanyard. Roland is 3 years older than me. He moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, in 1994 to build what became a fairly successful real estate investment firm, Doss Capital Partners, and by the time our mother started needing help, he had a house with a pool shaped like a kidney bean and a wife named Denise who drove a white Range Rover and posted photos of it with captions like blessed. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it matters for what comes later. How far away comfortable can make a person feel from the people who actually need them. In late 2018, my mother had a fall in her kitchen. Nothing broken, but it scared her, and it scared me more. I drove over to Zunis Avenue that same night and found her sitting on the linoleum with a bag of frozen peas against her hip, more embarrassed than hurt, insisting she didn't need an ambulance, insisting she was fine, insisting the whole time in a voice that was just a half step too thin to be convincing. That was the beginning. Not a dramatic beginning, just a quiet one, the kind nobody puts in a photo album. My wife Carol is a retired nurse, 30 years at St. Francis Hospital, and she took one look at my mother's blood pressure log and her pill organizer, half the compartments wrong, and said the thing out loud that I'd been avoiding saying to myself. Walt, she needs someone checking on her every single day. Not someday. Now. I called Roland that week. I remember exactly where I was standing, in my shop, holding a chisel, phone wedged against my shoulder. I told him about the fall, about the pill organizer, about the blood pressure numbers Carol didn't like. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, Walt, I've got 3 deals closing this quarter. I can't just drop everything. Can you keep an eye on her for now? I'll figure something out on my end. I said, sure. I want you to notice that word, sure, because I've turned it over 100 times since. It cost me nothing to say, and it ended up costing me 6 years of Tuesdays. For now turned into 6 years. I want to walk you through what those years actually looked like, because most families going through this never get the chance to say it out loud to anyone who understands. It wasn't one long, dramatic vigil. It was a schedule. 6:15 every morning, before the shop opened at 9, I'd pull into the driveway on Zunis Avenue in my old Ford, walk in through the kitchen door, she never locked no matter how many times I asked her to, and find her already awake, sitting at the table in her robe, waiting on the coffee I'd start because her hands had gotten too unsteady to manage the percolator by 2020. I'd lay out her morning pills in the plastic organizer, lisinopril, furosemide, a potassium supplement, metoprolol for her heart rhythm, and watch her take each one, because Carol had told me watching mattered more than trusting. Some mornings she was sharp as a tack, asking about a piece of furniture I was restoring, a walnut sideboard, or a church pew somebody wanted turned into a hallway bench. Other mornings, especially after 2021, she'd call me by my father's name, Frank, without noticing she'd done it, and I learned not to correct her, just to answer to it. Carol came by most afternoons, checking blood pressure, checking for swelling in the ankles that would tell us the heart failure was creeping forward again, listening to lungs with a stethoscope she kept in the glove box of her Buick like other retired people keep sunglasses. She never once complained about it. I asked her once, maybe 18 months in, whether she resented it, giving up so many afternoons that were supposed to be ours. She looked at me like I'd asked something slightly foolish. "Walt," she said, "this is what marriage is. You think I married you for the easy years?" Roland called every couple of weeks, sometimes less, and I want to be fair to him here. The calls were real. He asked genuine questions. Is she eating? Is she sleeping? Does she need anything I can order and have shipped? He sent a heated blanket in the winter of 2020 and a new recliner in 2022. What he never did, not once in 6 years, was ask if I needed anything. Not a call, not a break, not so much as a Sunday afternoon off. I told myself that was fine. People ask me later how something like this stretches on so long without anybody stepping in to stop it. The answer is that it never looks like a decision from the inside. It looks like a Tuesday, then another Tuesday, then 5 years of Tuesdays. We didn't tell anyone we were doing this like it was some kind of sacrifice. It didn't feel like one at the time. It felt like being her son. Birthday cards from Roland arrived reliably. Always signed Love, Roland, Denise, and the kids, even though by then his kids were grown and mostly out of the house. He visited twice a year, usually around the holidays, flying in for 2 or 3 days, taking her to the Cheesecake Factory on Utica Square, posting a photo with a caption about family being everything, then flying back to Scottsdale. I didn't say anything to him about the imbalance. Not for years. I want you to sit with that, because it matters later. I never once called my brother and said you need to do more. I told myself it wasn't a competition, that showing up wasn't a debt he owed me, that my mother didn't measure love in miles driven. Looking back, I think I was afraid of what would happen if I said it out loud. I think some part of me already knew how he'd twist it. In the spring of 2019, something shifted that I didn't understand until much later. Roland flew in for what he called a quick visit, just 2 days, no holiday attached to it. He took our mother to lunch alone, no Denise, which was unusual. When I stopped by that evening to check her pills, she was quieter than usual. Not upset exactly. Careful. The way a person gets when they're turning something over in their mind and haven't decided what to do with it yet. I asked her if everything was all right. She patted my hand and said, "Roland just wanted to talk business, honey. Nothing for you to worry about." I let it go. That was my second mistake, though I wouldn't understand it was a mistake for 5 more years. I mentioned it to Carol that night, lying in bed, the ceiling fan ticking overhead. Something felt off today, I told her. Roland took her to lunch alone, and afterwards she was different. Quiet. Careful. Carol said, "Maybe it's nothing, Walt. Maybe he just told her something about the business." I remember agreeing with her, mostly because it was easier than sitting with the alternative. My mother never mentioned that lunch again for the rest of her life. Not once. 6 years of Tuesday mornings, and she never brought it up, which should have told me something all on its own. Here's the thing nobody tells you about caregiving. It doesn't happen in dramatic scenes. It happens in thousands of small ones that erode you slowly enough that you don't notice the shape you're losing until you look back at photographs and realize how much older you got in years that all blur into a single long gray hallway. I missed my own granddaughter's school play in 2021 because my mother had a UTI that sent her temperature up and her mind sideways for 11 confusing, frightening hours. I canceled a wedding anniversary trip to Eureka Springs in 2022 because her cardiologist wanted to adjust her medication and I didn't trust anyone else to watch for the side effects. Carol never once complained. Not once in 6 years. That's the kind of woman I married, and I don't say that lightly. By early 2023, my mother's heart was failing in the specific, technical sense doctors use that word, congestive heart failure, stage C. Her cardiologist told us at St. Francis, the fluid building in her lungs no matter how carefully we managed her sodium and her diuretics. We brought in hospice that November. A nurse named Renee started coming 3 times a week, and within a month she was coming every day. And within 2 months she was staying overnight some nights, so Carol and I could actually sleep in our own bed instead of the recliner in my mother's living room. Those last 5 months are the part of this story I hold on to the most, and the part one talk about the least. I learned the specific sound her breathing made when the fluid was building, a wet, labored rhythm the hospice manual called Shane Stokes breathing, though none of us called it that out loud. We just called it the bad nights. I learned to keep a small oxygen concentrator humming in the corner of her bedroom, a sound I still hear sometimes in the quiet moments in my shop. Grief doesn't wait politely for the funeral. It starts arriving in pieces months before, in the way a mother's hand feels lighter in yours every single week. Roland flew in twice during those 5 months, 3 days each time, sitting with her, holding her hand. And I want to say clearly, because it matters, those visits were not nothing. She lit up both times he walked through that door, the same way she used to light up when I was a boy and my father came home from a long haul. I don't discount that. I never have. What I do know is that between those 2 visits, I called him every single time something changed, every hospital admission, every medication adjustment, every night Renee's face told me more than her words did. I have the phone records if anybody ever wants to see them, which, as it turns out, somebody eventually did. There was one person outside of me and Carol who showed up consistently during those years, and I want to introduce her now because she matters more than almost anyone in this story. My niece, Paige, Roland and Denise's daughter, was 27 years old by the time my mother passed. She'd grown up mostly in Arizona, but she'd come back to Tulsa for nursing school at OU's Tulsa campus. And something about being close to her grandmother again seemed to matter to her in a way it never seemed to matter to her father. Paige started stopping by Zunis Avenue on her own, unprompted, sometimes twice a week, bringing my mother crossword books and sitting with her while she watched her afternoon game shows. She never made it a production. She never posted about it. She just showed up, the way I'd been showing up, and I noticed, and my mother noticed, and I think that noticing is going to matter a great deal in about 10 minutes of this story. My mother passed on a Tuesday morning in April, at home, in her own bed on Zunis Avenue, with Renee on one side of her and me on the other, Carol holding her feet, the way you hold the feet of someone who spent her whole life on them for other people. It was quiet. It was, in its own way, exactly the kind of ending she would have chosen if anyone had asked her to plan it. I called Roland from the driveway before the funeral home even arrived. He didn't cry on that call. I remember that specifically because of what came 4 days later. I didn't know it yet, but my mother had made one more decision about all of this, months earlier, sitting at her kitchen table with her attorney, and she hadn't told a single living soul what it said. Not me, not Carol, not Paige. She'd sealed it, handed it to a woman named Diane Patterson, and told her exactly when and how it should be opened. I had no idea any of that existed. I was about to find out at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible way, standing beside a casket while my own brother pointed a finger at my chest. The service was held at Fitzgerald and Sons Funeral Home on Riverside Drive, a place my mother had actually picked out herself years earlier, walking through it with my father before he passed, the two of them treating the whole outing like they were choosing a hotel for a trip neither one particularly wanted to take, but both understood was coming. 40-some people came. Neighbors from Brookside who'd known her 40 years. Ladies from her Tuesday Bridge group, most of them in their 80s themselves, moving slow and careful in the parking lot. Renee came, off the clock, in a plain gray dress instead of scrubs, and I almost didn't recognize her out of uniform until she hugged me, and I caught that same steady calm she always carried into that house. Roland flew in the night before with Denise. Paige drove up separately from her apartment near campus, arriving early, sitting with Carol and me in the family room before the doors opened, her eyes red, her hand finding mine at one point, and just holding it the way you hold on to something solid when the ground feels unreliable. I gave the eulogy. I hadn't planned to, exactly, but the funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Halloway, asked during the family meeting the day before if one of the sons would like to speak, and Roland had said, without much hesitation, Walt should do it. He was with her more. I remember that sentence specifically because of how differently it would sound coming back at me less than 24 hours later. Looking back, there were signs at that family meeting too, small ones, the kind you only recognize once you know how the story ends. Roland flipped through the casket catalog with a brisk efficiency that struck me as strange at the time, picked the mahogany, upgraded the flower package without asking anyone else, and told Mr. Holloway he wanted the obituary to mention Doss Capital Partners, so his business contacts back in Scottsdale would understand why he might need to leave a day early. Nobody said anything. I remember Aunt Ruth's eyebrows going up just slightly and coming back down just as fast. I talked about her coffee, weak and terrible, and exactly how she liked it. I talked about the way she used to stand at the kitchen window on Zunis Avenue and narrate the neighborhood like a play only she could see. That Henderson boy is speeding again. Somebody ought to say something. I talked about my father's garage and the lawnmower he never finished fixing, and I said that I thought some part of my mother had been fixing something for the rest of us this whole time too. Just as quietly, just as stubbornly. People laughed in the right places. People cried in the right places. I sat back down next to Carol and felt, for just a moment, like maybe the hardest part was behind me. It wasn't. After the service, at the graveside, under a green funeral tent that did almost nothing against an Oklahoma wind that kept trying to lift the flower arrangements right off their stands, the funeral director invited close family to stay a few extra minutes before the crowd moved on to the reception hall. It was just us then. Me, Carol, Roland, Denise, Paige, and my mother's sister, my Aunt Ruth, 84 years old and leaning on a cane with a rubber tip worn smooth. Roland stepped up beside the casket, and for a second I thought he was going to say something about our mother. Something soft. Something final. Instead, he turned, and he looked directly at me, and his voice came out loud enough that people 20 feet away, still filing toward their cars, actually stopped walking. "You know," he said, and I remember the specific cruelty of how calm he sounded doing it. "I hope you're proud of yourself, Walt. You spent 6 years cutting me out of Mom's life, feeding her whatever story you wanted her to believe, and now you stand up there giving some sweet little speech like you were the only son who loved her. You ruined this family. You did this. Not me." I want to be honest about what that moment felt like. People expect me to say I was furious, and I wasn't, not right away. What I felt was closer to disorientation, the specific vertigo of hearing your own 6 years described back to you in a shape you don't recognize. I stood there in the wind with my mother's casket 4 feet away, and I honestly could not, for a moment, find a single word. Carol's hand found my arm. Aunt Ruth's mouth had gone into a thin, tight line. Paige was staring at her father like she'd never seen him before in her life, which, in a certain sense, maybe she hadn't. Denise looked at the grass. "Roland," I said finally, and my voice came out quieter than his, which I think surprised him more than if I'd shouted. "This isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," he said. "You had her all to yourself for 6 years, and now you get to stand up there like the hero. I flew in every chance I got. I called her constantly. And somehow I'm the villain in whatever version of this you told her." I didn't argue with him. I want to be very clear about that, because it matters for everything that comes after. I did not defend myself. I did not list the mornings, the pill organizers, the 11 hours of a fever that made her call me by my father's name. I just stood there and let him say it, in front of my aunt, in front of my niece, in front of the wind pulling at the flowers on my mother's casket, because some part of me, even in that moment, understood that arguing with him there would only give the moment more shape, more life, more of exactly what he wanted. We're welcome to sit with what that costs a person, saying nothing when everything in you wants to correct the record. I've thought about it a great deal since. I think silence, in that specific moment, was the only dignified thing left available to me. I didn't know yet that I wouldn't need to defend myself much longer at all. As we walked back toward the cars, Mr. Holloway, the funeral director, caught my elbow gently and said, quietly, just to me, "Your mother left something with us, Mr. Doss. An envelope. She was very particular about the timing. She wanted it given to you after the service, in front of the family, at the reception, not before. I have it locked in my desk. I just wanted you to know it exists, so it doesn't come as a shock when I bring it out." I nodded. I said thank you. And I walked toward the reception hall with a strange, cold clarity settling into my chest, the specific feeling of understanding that something is about to happen that you cannot stop and do not yet understand. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge Stories. If you're just joining us, grab whatever you're having with your coffee this morning, because this next part is the reason I sat down to tell this story in the first place. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from today, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and hit subscribe, because what came out of that envelope didn't just answer my brother. It answered 6 years of my life. The reception hall at Fitzgerald and Sons was a plain room with round tables, coffee urns, and a table along the back wall covered in the kind of casseroles and sheet cakes that Brookside neighbors bring because it's the only language some people have for grief. I stood near the doorway with a paper cup of coffee I wasn't drinking, watching Roland accept condolences from my mother's bridge friends with a practiced, sorrowful nod I now understood he'd probably used before. Mr. Halloway found me about 20 minutes in. He had a manila envelope in his hand, my mother's handwriting across the front in the careful, slightly shaky cursive she'd developed in her last 2 years, Walter, and beneath it, to be opened at the reception, with family present. Not before. I did not plan to make a scene. I am not, by nature, a man who makes scenes. But my mother had specifically instructed that this be opened with family present, and I understood, standing there with that envelope in my hand, that she had planned this moment with the same care she planned everything else in her life, quietly, years in advance, and that whatever was inside was meant to be heard, not just read. I asked Mr. Halloway if I could have a moment to gather the family. He nodded and stepped back. I found Carol first, and she squeezed my hand once and said nothing, because 30 years of marriage means she already understood I needed to do this myself. I asked Paige to come stand near me. I asked Aunt Ruth, who set her cane against the nearest table and folded her hands in front of her like she was bracing for something, though she couldn't have known what. And then, because my mother had said family, I walked over to where Roland was standing with Denise near the coffee urn, and I said, quietly, Mom left something. She wanted it opened here, with everyone. Roland's face did something complicated. For just a fraction of a second, I saw something flicker there that I would later understand was closer to fear than curiosity. Then it smoothed back over into the same composed sorrow he'd been wearing all morning. Whatever it is, Walt, he said, loud enough for a few heads to turn, I hope it's the truth for once. I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, for Pages, handwritten on the yellow legal pad my mother kept in her kitchen drawer for grocery lists and phone messages, and a second, smaller sealed envelope with Page's name written across the front. I unfolded the letter. I recognized her handwriting from 1,000 birthday cards, 1,000 grocery lists, steadier here than it had been in her final years, which told me she'd written this a long time before she needed it. I read it out loud. I want to tell you exactly what it said, because every word of it mattered, and because I think my mother, in her own quiet way, wanted it to be heard exactly like this, in a room full of the people it concerned. To my family, it began. If you're hearing this read aloud, then I'm gone, and I imagine some of you are standing closer together than others, and I imagine I know exactly why. I want to start by saying something I should have said out loud years ago, while I still could. Walter, you have taken care of me every single day for 6 years without once asking me to notice. I noticed. I noticed every morning you showed up before your shop opened. I noticed every time Carol checked my blood pressure with that same patient face she probably used on strangers for 30 years at the hospital. I noticed the wedding anniversary you and Carol gave up in 2022 because I heard you two talking about Eureka Springs in the kitchen, and I heard you decide, without a single complaint, to stay instead. I was not as confused in those years as some of you assumed. I was tired. There is a difference, and I want that difference on the record. The room had gone very still by this point. I could hear the coffee urn humming behind me. I kept reading. Roland, the letter went on. I need to explain something now that I could never quite make myself say to your face, because I did not want to lose you, and I was afraid that saying this plainly would cost me the only version of you I still had access to, which was 2 visits a year and a phone call every couple of weeks. I felt the room shift. I saw Denise's hand go still on her coffee cup. I saw Roland's jaw tighten in a way I recognized from every argument we'd had as boys, 40 and 50 years ago, in a house that no longer belonged to either of us. In April of 2019, my mother's letter continued. You came to visit me alone, and over lunch at the Cheesecake Factory you told me you were worried about my finances being mismanaged, and you asked me to sign paperwork adding you as a joint owner on my primary checking account and my certificate of deposit at Bank of Oklahoma. For my protection, you said. I told you I would think about it. I did think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks, and then I called Diane Patterson, my attorney, and I asked her to look into whether that paperwork you left with me that day was really what you told me it was. It was not. I let that sentence sit in the room exactly as long as it needed to. Nobody moved. Somewhere behind me, one of the bridge club ladies had gone very still with a paper plate half raised to her mouth, and I remember thinking, absurdly, in that frozen second, that she probably wished she'd left for her car 5 minutes earlier. The document you asked me to sign, the letter continued, would have given you sole authority to withdraw funds from those accounts without my consent, and would have removed Walter as the secondary contact the bank had on file since your father passed. Diane explained to me that this is, functionally, one of the most common forms of financial exploitation practiced against people my age, and that if I had signed it without reading it carefully, you would have had legal access to nearly $200,000 of your father's and my savings, with no obligation to tell me, or anyone, when or how you used it. In February of 2021, I had a night where my fever climbed high enough that I stopped knowing where I was. Walter tells me I called him Frank 3 times and asked when your father was coming home from the yard. I woke the next morning to find him asleep upright in the chair, still in yesterday's clothes, because he wouldn't leave until my fever broke. I called you the next day, Roland, and you said you were sorry you couldn't get away that week. I understood that then. I want it written down now, plainly, because a person's life should have an honest record somewhere, even the parts that are hard to read. I did not confront you. I want to explain why, because I think you all deserve to understand the choice I made and not just the silence that followed it. I was 84 years old. I had already lost my husband. I did not want to lose my oldest son in the same decade, and I told myself that if I simply declined to sign, quietly, without accusation, we could go on as we had been, 2 visits a year, a phone call now and then, and I could keep loving the version of you I had always loved without forcing either of us to look directly at what you had tried to do. I was wrong to protect you from that conversation, Roland. I understand that now, sitting here writing this, knowing that my silence let you build a story in your own head where Walter was the one who pulled us apart, when in fact it was you who tried to take something from me and never once knew that I found out. Denise had set her coffee cup down entirely. Roland's face had gone the color of the folded tablecloth behind him. I kept every record, the letter went on. Diane has copies of the original document you asked me to sign, along with her written analysis of what it actually would have permitted. I also want you to know that Bank of Oklahoma flagged 2 attempts, in June of 2019 and again in March of 2020, to add a joint signer to my accounts using paperwork that did not carry my authorization. I did not pursue either instance legally, because I did not want to spend whatever years I had left in a courtroom with my own son. But I wrote it all down, dates, amounts, conversations, in a journal Diane also has a copy of, because I decided a long time ago that the truth deserves to exist somewhere, even if I was not brave enough to say it to your face while I was alive to watch you hear it. I looked up from the page for just a second. Roland was staring at the letter in my hands like it might rearrange itself if he looked hard enough. The exact same look I'd watched cross another man's face in a different story once, though I didn't know that yet. Of course, I only know it now, telling you this. Denise had taken a full step away from him without seeming to notice she'd done it. I finished the letter. Walter, my mother had written, near the end, I am leaving the house on Zunis Avenue and the remainder of my estate to be divided according to the will Diane has on file, which I updated in May of 2019, 1 month after I understood what your brother had tried to do. I made you executor because you were the one who showed up every single day, without needing me to say thank you out loud. I am saying it now. Thank you. And Paige, sweetheart, if you are standing there listening to this, I want you to open the smaller envelope. I have watched you choose to show up for me in exactly the way your father chose not to, and I do not believe that should go unnoticed simply because you are the one it would be easiest to overlook. There is a trust with your name on it at the same bank, funded quietly over the last 4 years, meant for your nursing school and whatever comes after it. Your grandfather would have been so proud of the person you decided to become, in a house full of people who did not always show you how. I love every one of you. The letter ended. Even the ones of you who are going to have a hard time hearing this today, especially those of you. Because love, in my experience, was never about who visited more. It was about who told the truth when it mattered, and I am finally telling it. Love, Mom. I folded the letter. Nobody in that room said anything for what felt like a very long time. Aunt Ruth had her hand pressed flat against her chest. Carol was crying quietly, the kind of crying that doesn't make a sound. Paige stood frozen, staring at the small envelope with her name on it that I had just handed her, her fingers not quite steady enough yet to open it. Roland finally spoke, and his voice had lost every trace of the composed sorrow he'd been performing all morning. "That's," he said, and stopped. "That's not." He tried again, and stopped again. I did not shout at my brother in that reception hall. I did not need to. I simply looked at him, the same way I'd looked at him at the graveside 20 minutes earlier, and I said, quietly, "You told me I ruined this family. I let you say it, Roland, because I didn't want to make Mom's funeral about a fight. But she just told this whole room who actually did." He didn't have an answer for that. Denise left the reception about 10 minutes later, alone, taking her own car. I heard through Paige much later that she moved out of the house in Scottsdale within 6 weeks, which I felt only as a quiet, tired sense that some things simply take the time they take to become visible. I called Diane Patterson the following Monday. Diane confirmed everything in the letter, point by point, and produced copies of the 2019 document Roland had asked our mother to sign, a joint account authorization form from Bank of Oklahoma that would have granted him sole withdrawal rights with no notification requirement, meaning the bank would never have alerted my mother, or me, to a single transaction. She also had the journal my mother had kept afterward, dated entries going back 5 years, small and steady and devastating in their plainness. Roland called again today, asked about the CD. I told him I'd think about it. That was the entire entry for June 14, 2019. My mother had been quietly building a record of a conversation she never planned to have out loud, until she decided, near the end, that she would. Diane also walked me through the estate paperwork itself. The house on Zunis Avenue, appraised at just over $210,000, was left to me outright. The remainder of the accounts, roughly $340,000 combined between savings, the CD, and a modest stock portfolio my father had built one purchase at a time over 4 decades, was split according to a formula my mother had worked out with Diane in May of 2019 and never once revised. Roland's share was fixed at $25,000, a specific bequest rather than a percentage, which Diane told me was intentional, a legal way of making certain nobody could later argue Eleanor Doss simply forgot to update a document. She hadn't forgotten anything. She had decided. The trust in Paige's name, exactly as the letter said, had been quietly funded for consecutive years running, a little at a time, never large enough to notice on a monthly statement, but steady enough that by the time my mother passed it had grown to just over $60,000, waiting for a granddaughter who had no idea it existed until she opened a small envelope in a room full of grieving strangers and family. Paige called me 2 days later, her voice still thick. "Uncle Walt," she said, "I don't understand why she picked me. I didn't do anything special. I just liked visiting her." "That," I told her, standing in my shop on Peoria Avenue with a half-finished rocking chair in front of me, "is exactly why she picked you. You never once did it because you thought it earned you something. That's the only kind of love that counts, as far as I can tell. The kind that doesn't know it's being watched." I offered Paige something else that same week, something that had nothing to do with money. I told her my shop door was open any Saturday. She wanted to learn how to work with her hands the way her great-grandfather and I both had. She showed up the following weekend, sawdust in her hair by the end of it, laughing for what I think was the first time since the funeral, and she has shown up most Saturdays since. Watching her learn to sand a table leg down to bare, honest wood has done more for my own grief than almost anything else this year. As for Roland, I know some of you are hoping I'll tell you I cut him off entirely, slammed every door, never spoke to him again. That's not quite what happened, and it's important to tell you the truth instead of the version that feels more satisfying. I did not seek legal action against him. My mother had made her choice about that clearly, in writing, and I respected it, even though Diane told me the documentation would have supported a case if I'd wanted one. What I did instead was simpler, and in its own way, harder for him to sit with. I told him, in a phone call about 2 weeks after the funeral, that I would always be his brother, that I wasn't interested in punishing him for the rest of his life over something Mom herself had chosen not to punish him for. But trust, once a person understands what it costs to lose it, doesn't come back just because time passes. It comes back because a person changes. I told him the door wasn't locked. I told him it also wasn't going to open itself. He was quiet on the line for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since we were boys sharing a bedroom in the house on Zunis Avenue. Before either of us understood what any of this would eventually cost. I don't know how to be the man she thought I could still become, Walt. Then start small, I told him. That's how the rest of us did it. One Tuesday at a time. I don't know yet whether he will. That part of the story isn't finished, and I'm not going to pretend it is for the sake of a tidy ending. What I do know is this. My mother spent the last 6 years of her life watching two sons show her two very different kinds of love. One measured in miles and holiday photographs. The other measured in Tuesday mornings nobody photographed at all. And in the end, she found a way to tell the truth about both of them without raising her voice once. For pages, written years in advance. Waiting patiently in a locked drawer for exactly the right moment to be heard. I think about that specific kind of courage often now. The courage it takes to write the truth down and trust it will find its way to the people who need it, even after you're no longer there to say it yourself. I think about my mother at that kitchen table on Zunis Avenue. Sun coming through the same window she used to narrate the neighborhood from. Choosing her words the way she chose everything else in her life, carefully, with the whole family's future weighed out long before any of us understood there was anything left to weigh. I still drive past that house sometimes, even though it's someone else's now, a young couple with a dog and a tricycle in the yard. I don't stop. I don't need to. What I needed from that house, I already carry with me, in the quiet, stubborn shape of a woman who spent 89 years believing that showing up, without needing anyone to notice, was the truest form of love a person could offer. She was right about that. It just took the rest of us a little longer to understand it than it took her. If this story meant something to you today, I hope you'll take a moment to like it and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you're new here, welcome to Sweet Family Revenge Stories. We'll see you in the next one.